Manila, the Pearl of the Orient, the city of lights, music, and laughter, was reduced to ashes in a sea of fire. Not by nature's wrath, but by human hands. A city consumed by flames born of honor, revenge, and the cruel logic of war. At the center of that fire stood one man who had stepped out of legend, Douglas MacArthur, the general who once swore, "I shall return." In March 1942, as black smoke rose from the jungled hills of Bataan, MacArthur stood silently on the pier at Corregidor, eyes fixed on the horizon. Japanese troops were closing in, the Filipino-American garrison was collapsing, and he was under direct orders to leave, not out of cowardice but because Washington needed him alive to organize the counterstrike. Late that night, under the shroud of darkness, he boarded a tiny PT boat with his wife, his son, and a handful of officers. As the boat slipped into open sea, he turned back one last time toward the fading shoreline, where tens of thousands of his men still held out. He whispered, almost to himself, "I shall return." Those 3 words, simple yet thunderous, carried the weight of guilt, pride, and destiny. To the Filipino people they were a promise of deliverance. To MacArthur, they became an oath carved into his very soul. Ever since that night, he lived haunted by what he had left behind. News of the Bataan Death March, thousands of prisoners beaten, starved, and killed along the road, seared into his conscience. Each report was a reminder of unfinished duty. Night after night he studied the map of the Pacific, tracing the long road home like an exile staring toward the land of his birth. By 1944, the tide of war had turned. After victories in the Marianas, the U.S. High Command debated its next move. Should they bypass the Philippines and strike directly at Formosa and Japan, or return first to liberate the islands? Admiral Nimitz and the Navy saw little strategic value in the Philippines. It would be costly and time-consuming. MacArthur, furious, argued from the heart as much as from strategy. He told President Roosevelt, "If we do not return, we will betray millions who fought beside us. We will lose the soul of America." It wasn't military logic, it was moral conviction. Roosevelt hesitated, then finally nodded. The decision was made. MacArthur would return to the Philippines. On October 20th, 1944, waves crashed against the beaches of Leyte. American soldiers of the 6th Army stormed ashore under a curtain of smoke and shell fire. Hours later, MacArthur's command ship drew close to the surf. Dressed in immaculate khaki, cap gleaming with silver stars, and his trademark swagger stick in hand, he stepped into the shallows beside Philippine President Sergio Osmeña and General Carlos Romulo. Under light rain, he waded slowly toward the beach, photographers capturing each deliberate stride. Those few seconds became one of the most iconic images of the Pacific War. The old general walking back onto the soil he had once lost. Standing on that same sand, MacArthur made his broadcast. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated by the blood of our 2 peoples." His voice carried across the islands like a sermon. To the Filipinos, it was a resurrection. To MacArthur, redemption. But war rarely obeys the dreams of men. Leyte was no stage for triumph. It was a swamp of rain, mud, and death. Japanese forces, under the brilliant yet doomed General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, fought with fanatical resolve. Yamashita, who had once humbled the British at Singapore, now understood that defeat was inevitable, yet he accepted it with grim calm. If this is where I must die, then so be it. The battle dragged on for over 2 months. MacArthur grew impatient. He wanted a swift, symbolic victory, proof that destiny favored him. But the jungle refused to yield. The Leyte Gulf naval battle, the largest sea engagement in history, raged offshore, annihilating the remnants of Japan's fleet. On land, though, the fighting was slow, vicious, and unrelenting. Kamikaze pilots turned the sky into a graveyard. Every yard of ground was paid for in blood. When casualty reports piled up, MacArthur scowled and sent curt orders. Continue the attack. Do not halt. On December 25, 1944, he declared Leyte secure, even though thousands of Japanese troops still held out in the mountains, a premature proclamation that would become his habit throughout the campaign. Deep down, he knew Leyte was only the beginning. The real objective was Luzon, the heart of the archipelago, home to the capital Manila and the vital Clark Field Air Base. He believed that once Manila fell, the war in the Philippines would end, and his vow from 1942 would finally be fulfilled. One evening, standing on the deck of his flagship, he gazed north toward the setting sun and murmured to his aide, "From that place I once departed in humiliation. Now I shall return in triumph." Yet he could not know that the city he longed to liberate, Manila, the Pearl of the Orient with its old churches, shaded boulevards, and gentle Pasig River, was destined to become an inferno. In the months ahead, hundreds of thousands would die, not because one side lost, but because neither could stop. Manila would not simply be captured, it would be obliterated. When the first American troops landed on Leyte in October 1944, the beaches were quiet, the palm trees swaying under gray tropical clouds. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Japanese had given up. Soldiers in drenched uniforms pushed inland through the wet sand, their boots sinking into the soft earth. They joked about being home by Christmas, but beneath the mist and the mud, a storm was gathering, one that would decide not only the fate of the Philippines but the shape of the Pacific War itself. Douglas MacArthur had returned, and with him came the massive U.S. Sixth Army under General Walter Kruger. Their task seemed straightforward: capture Leyte, secure its airfields, and open the door to Luzon and Manila. On paper, it looked like a short campaign. "Leyte will fall in 10 days, MacArthur assured his staff. Yet those 10 days would turn into 70. The island, drenched in monsoon rain, became a quagmire of blood, steel, and stubborn resistance. The Japanese high command was unprepared for the speed and scale of the American assault. The initial defenders, under General Shiro Makino, were outnumbered and undersupplied. But within days, Tokyo ordered reinforcements from neighboring islands, determined to turn Leyte into a graveyard for MacArthur's ambitions. At the center of this decision stood General Tomoyuki Yamashita, newly transferred from Manchuria. Known to the Allies as the Tiger of Malaya for his lightning conquest of Singapore in 1942, Yamashita was both feared and respected. Yet, when he received his orders to defend the Philippines, he sighed. "So, it has come at last. My turn to die." Yamashita's strategy was defensive by necessity. He knew Japan's navy was crippled, its air power diminished, and its logistics shattered. Still, the Imperial Command demanded a decisive battle to slow the American advance. Reinforcements poured into Leyte, some ferried through the night in small transports, others swimming ashore after their ships were sunk by American aircraft. They arrived without food, without ammunition, but with orders to fight to the death. "Every man a bomb," one officer wrote in his diary. The Americans, meanwhile, faced enemies, both human and natural. The tropical downpours turned roads into rivers of mud, bogging down tanks and trucks. Supply convoys struggled through mountain trails while mosquitoes, disease, and exhaustion claimed almost as many men as bullets. "You couldn't tell where the front line was," one GI recalled. "It was just rain, leeches, and death." Despite the misery, progress was steady. By early November, U.S. troops had taken the Leyte Valley, cutting the island in half. Yet the Japanese refused to yield. The ridges and jungles east of Ormoc became killing fields. As small Japanese units fought from caves and foxholes, sniping, ambushing, and dying in silence. For every hill the Americans captured, another erupted in gunfire. MacArthur's optimism, his belief that divine destiny guided his return, met the raw chaos of reality. His headquarters issued proclamations of victory even as his men were dying in swamps less than a mile away. Offshore, a far greater battle erupted, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944. It was the largest naval engagement in human history. The Japanese launched a desperate three-pronged assault to annihilate the American invasion fleet. Kamikaze pilots dove into carriers in waves of fire. Off Samar, a handful of small American escort ships and destroyers, nicknamed Taffy 3, charged at a force of battleships and cruisers several times their size. Commander Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston sent a final message before disappearing into the sea. "We're going in. Give 'em hell." The battle ended in catastrophe for Japan. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and 10 cruisers were lost. The once mighty Imperial Navy ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. But even victory came with a price. Hundreds of American sailors were killed, many drifting for days among burning oil slicks. The sea was on fire, one survivor remembered. You could smell death on the waves. Back on land, the campaign dragged on into December. MacArthur, frustrated by the slow progress, blamed the weather and his subordinates. Yet his real problem was Yamashita's persistence. The Japanese general, unable to win, sought instead to bleed the Americans dry. He ordered his troops to fight delaying actions, retreating into the mountains to extend the battle for as long as possible. When one of his officers asked whether the emperor still expected victory, Yamashita replied, "The emperor expects us to die well." By early December, the Americans had captured Ormoc, Yamashita's main supply port. Cut off from reinforcements, the Japanese position on Leyte began to collapse. Starving soldiers scavenged roots and insects. Some resorted to cannibalism. Private diaries recovered later revealed the despair. "The war is lost. Our homeland will burn. I want to go home, but home no longer exists." On December 25th, MacArthur announced that Leyte was secured. In truth, Japanese stragglers would continue fighting in the hills for 4 more months. Yet, strategically, the battle was won. The Americans now possessed a springboard for their next and greatest objective, Luzon. The cost was staggering: 3,500 Americans killed, over 11,000 wounded, and more than 60,000 Japanese dead. The land that had once been a paradise of rice fields and palm groves was now a wasteland of craters and bones. MacArthur toured the island soon after. Reporters described him walking silently through the wreckage, his face drawn and distant. Near the beach where he had first landed, he paused and looked out to sea. "It was here," he said quietly, "that the promise began. Now we must finish it." To him, Leyte was not an end but a bridge, a path leading back to Manila, the city he had once called my home. Yet, even as he prepared for the final campaign, the general was unaware of how much darker the road ahead would become. Manila would not greet him with open arms or garlands of flowers. It would greet him with fire. The road to Manila began not with the roar of engines, but with silence. An uneasy, deceptive calm that spread across the waters of Lingayen Gulf in the first days of January 1945. Dawn broke over the sea, painting the sky in muted pink and gray as wave after wave of landing craft approached the beaches of Luzon. On board were over 150,000 American troops, veterans hardened by Leyte's mud and fire, now heading toward the greatest prize in the Philippines. The men were tense, expecting heavy resistance. Instead, the beaches were eerily still. No gunfire, no explosions. Just the whisper of the surf and the distant hum of engines. "It felt wrong," one Marine later said. "Too quiet, like the enemy was waiting somewhere else." General Walter Kruger, commander of the U.S. Sixth Army, had prepared for the worst. He had seen the cost of underestimating the Japanese, yet as his men came ashore on January 9th, they found only scattered resistance. The beachheads fell in hours, and by nightfall the Americans had established a solid foothold on Luzon. MacArthur, who had insisted on accompanying the landings despite the danger, came ashore soon after. Dressed immaculate as always, pipe clenched between his teeth, he told reporters, "The decisive battle for the liberation of the Philippines has begun." It was his moment of triumph, but also the beginning of a tragedy he could not yet foresee. The success at Lingayen baffled many. Where were the Japanese? Kruger suspected a trap. His cautious nature made him wary of advancing too quickly, especially across open terrain ideal for ambush. MacArthur, however, had little patience for hesitation. To him, speed was everything. He wanted Manila captured before the enemy could destroy it, before the world's attention shifted elsewhere. His orders were simple: advance fast, take Clark Field, reach the capital. The clash between his impatience and Kruger's methodical approach became one of the campaign's defining tensions. Intelligence reports fed this conflict. General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's loyal chief of intelligence, insisted that there were only 152,000 Japanese troops left on Luzon, poorly equipped and demoralized. Kruger disagreed. His reconnaissance teams and local guerrillas warned of at least twice that number. "We are not facing ghosts," he muttered in his diary. "We are facing men with rifles, and they intend to die here." He was right. In the mountains and jungles beyond the beaches, General Tomoyuki Yamashita had reorganized his scattered forces into 3 defensive zones, forming a plan of attrition rather than outright confrontation. Yamashita's army on Luzon numbered roughly 260,000 soldiers, but many were cooks, clerks, or construction workers armed with rifles from another era. Vehicles were scarce, radios unreliable, ammunition limited. He divided his troops into 3 commands: the Shobu Group in northern Luzon to defend the mountain ranges, the Kembu Group around Clark Field, and the Shimbu Group positioned in southern Luzon to guard Manila and the Bicol Peninsula. His plan was grimly pragmatic: delay the Americans for as long as possible, then retreat into the highlands to fight to the last man. It was a strategy not for victory, but for sacrifice. The Americans advanced inland rapidly, aided by thousands of Filipino guerrillas who acted as scouts, saboteurs, and guides. Many had fought in the shadows since 1942, living like ghosts in the jungle. Now, as MacArthur's troops returned, they emerged from hiding. Some barefoot, some armed with captured Japanese rifles, others with homemade weapons, and joined the march toward liberation. They knew every trail, every hill, a U.S. officer recalled. Without them, we'd still be lost in the cane fields. The first major objective was Clark Field, one of the largest air bases in the Far East. Kruger's 14th Corps, under General Oscar Griswold, pushed south from Lingayen through thick jungle and destroyed bridges. The Japanese fought delaying actions, blowing up crossings and ambushing convoys before fading into the hills. The Americans called them ghost troops. By late January, after days of heavy rain and stubborn resistance, Kruger's forces reached the outskirts of Clark Field. Then, in a pattern that would repeat itself, MacArthur prematurely announced its capture to the press. The news wires across America flashed, "Clark Field secured." In reality, Japanese forces still held the airfield in strength. Griswold, furious, wrote in his diary, "Japs hold Stotzenburg in force, though General MacArthur has already announced its capture. Why does he do this? It took 5 days of grinding combat to seize Clark Field and another 3 weeks to clear the surrounding fortifications. The once bustling air base was a wasteland of twisted metal and burned-out hangars. Yet its capture opened the road to Manila. The Sixth Army now prepared for the final push. MacArthur wanted to make the march to the capital a triumphal procession, a liberation parade for the cameras. "We will enter Manila in glory," he told his staff. But the men on the ground knew better. The Japanese did not surrender cities. They turned them into tombs. As the advance resumed, two powerful formations, the 37th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division, formed what were known as flying columns, fast-moving assault groups of truck-mounted infantry, tanks, and mobile artillery. Their mission: reach Manila before the Japanese could destroy it. War correspondent Carl Meadens, who accompanied the column, described the chaos of the march. Sometimes we rode on highways, sometimes through fields and caribou trails. Almost all the bridges were out. We forded the rivers, men holding their weapons above their heads while the tanks pulled the trucks through the mud. Engines screamed, water flew, and still we kept moving. The advance was relentless. Villages cheered as convoys roared past, waving flags made from scraps of cloth. Old women wept, young boys saluted. To many Filipinos, the sight of American soldiers meant salvation at last. But not all reunions were joyful. In some places, guerrilla leaders reported that Japanese troops had massacred entire communities before retreating, leaving behind smoldering churches and empty streets. They killed everyone. One survivor whispered to an American chaplain, "They said we were all spies." By early February, the road to Manila lay open. Kruger's men had crossed the Pampanga River and were now less than 50 miles from the capital. To the south, another landing force under General Robert Eichelberger, the U.S. 8th Army, had come ashore at San Antonio and Nasugbu. Officially, it was a reconnaissance mission. Unofficially, MacArthur had given Eichelberger a far more enticing order. "This is your chance to be the Patton of the Pacific. Drive on Manila." It was a race now, two armies converging on the same city from north and south. The Americans believed they were closing in on a swift victory, a liberation that would finally end 3 years of occupation and humiliation. But deep inside Manila, another man, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, was preparing a very different kind of battle. He had 16,000 troops, vast stockpiles of munitions, and an unspoken resolve that Manila would not fall without a bloodbath. The Americans were coming to liberate the city. Iwabuchi was waiting to destroy it. When the road to Manila opened in early February 1945, it was not just soldiers who waited for liberation. Hidden behind barbed wire and crumbling walls across the Philippines were thousands of men, women, and children, American, Filipino, British, Dutch, and Australian, who had been prisoners since 1942. For them, the war had not been measured in battles or victories, but in days of hunger, disease, and humiliation. The approach of MacArthur's forces promised freedom, but also danger. They had seen what the Japanese did when defeat drew near. They feared that salvation might come too late. 3 years earlier, after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, the Japanese had captured nearly 11,000 American and 60,000 Filipino troops. Most were marched north under the blazing sun in the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands collapsed from thirst and were bayoneted on the roadside. Those who survived were packed into overcrowded prison camps, Cabanatuan, Bilibid, Davao, and dozens more. Others were shipped to Japan in rusting freighters the prisoners called hell ships. Few ever reached their destination. American submarines, unaware of their human cargo, sank many of them. By late 1944, as the tide of war turned, Japan's desperation grew. Prison guards were ordered to eliminate captives rather than allow their rescue. On Palawan Island, when U.S. planes began bombing nearby, Japanese soldiers forced 150 American POWs into trenches, poured gasoline over them, and set them ablaze. Only 11 escaped. News of the massacre reached MacArthur's headquarters weeks later. It shocked even hardened veterans. "If that is what they do in defeat," one officer said, "we must get to the others before it's too late." In Manila itself, nearly 7,800 Allied civilians had been interned since 1942. The largest camp was Santo Tomas University, converted into a sprawling prison under Japanese control. Here, professors, nurses, missionaries, and their families lived in classrooms and lecture halls turned into cells. At first, conditions were tolerable. Prisoners could organize classes, small concerts, even a makeshift chapel. But as the war dragged on, food vanished. By 1944, rations had fallen to a few ounces of rice per day. Disease spread and bodies were buried in the university garden. "We were skeletons in rags," recalled one survivor. But hope was the only thing they couldn't take. Elsewhere, at Bilibid Prison, the situation was even worse. Originally built for Filipino criminals, it had become a holding site for both military and civilian captives, men so emaciated that liberation would come as both a miracle and a shock. When MacArthur's troops finally reached Bilibid, many prisoners did not even recognize them as Americans. One sergeant remembered, "They looked at us like we were ghosts." One man whispered, "Are you real?" But before the Americans could reach Manila, a daring mission unfolded in the jungles of central Luzon, a rescue that would become one of the most extraordinary operations of the Pacific War. It was January 30th, 1945, and intelligence from Filipino guerrillas reported that 500 American POWs remained at Cabanatuan Camp near the town of Platero. The Japanese garrison was preparing to retreat, and U.S. commanders feared they would kill the prisoners before leaving. The task of saving them fell to a small team of U.S. Army Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas, a total of just 121 men. They moved by night, crawling through fields and creeks, guided by locals who risked their lives to show them the way. Near the camp, a lone American aircraft made a low pass overhead, deliberately drawing the Japanese guards' attention. In that instant, the Rangers charged. Within minutes, the camp erupted in chaos, gunfire, shouting, the thunder of grenades. "It was over before they knew we were there," one ranger recalled. "The guards were killed, the watchtowers set ablaze. Some prisoners were too weak to walk, others were blinded by tears. They kept touching us," another ranger said, as if to make sure we weren't just another dream. The rescue at Cabanatuan saved 512 men. When news reached the United States, it electrified the nation. Newspapers hailed it as proof that MacArthur's promise to free his people was more than propaganda. But behind the headlines lay a more complex truth. For every life saved at Cabanatuan, hundreds were still dying elsewhere. "We couldn't save them all," one Alamo scout later said quietly. "We just did what we could." As U.S. forces advanced toward Manila, they encountered more prisoners, both freed and forgotten. Some were abandoned in jungle camps, delirious with fever. Others had been marched to exhaustion and left by the roadside. Filipino villagers risked execution to hide and feed them. The war had erased all boundaries between soldier and civilian, rescuer and rescued. MacArthur was deeply affected by the reports. For him, the liberation of the prisoners was not just a military mission, it was personal. These were the men he had left behind in 1942. When he visited one of the camps, witnesses recalled his face tightening as he walked past rows of skeletal survivors. "You did not surrender," he told them softly. "You were not defeated, you endured." Then he turned away, eyes glistening behind his dark glasses. The rescue missions, though small in scale, carried immense symbolic power. They reminded the world what the war was supposed to mean. Not conquest or revenge, but redemption. And yet, even as these acts of heroism unfolded, darker scenes were already beginning inside Manila. Reports trickled in from Filipino guerrillas. Japanese troops were fortifying buildings, mining bridges, and taking civilians hostage. Something terrible was about to happen in the City of Light. The Americans pressed on. Every hour counted, but war moves faster than mercy, and by the time the first U.S. troops reached Manila's outskirts on February 3, 1945, the fires had already begun to burn. When the first American tanks rolled into the northern suburbs of Manila in early February 1945, they believed they were coming to liberate a city. Instead, they entered a trap. A maze of ruins, fire, and death designed by one man who refused to obey orders, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi. Born into an old naval family, Iwabuchi had once been a rising star in the Imperial Japanese Navy. In 1942, he commanded the battleship Kirishima, until its destruction during the Guadalcanal campaign. Though the loss was not entirely his fault, it left a deep scar on his honor. He was recalled to Japan in disgrace, stripped of command, and quietly sidelined. To a samurai-descended officer, there was no punishment greater than surviving one's own defeat. "I live," he wrote in his diary, "but my soul has drowned." By late 1944, as Japan's empire crumbled, Iwabuchi was reassigned to the Philippines to command the Naval Defense Force of Manila. On paper, his orders were simple: assist General Yamashita's army in delaying the American advance, then withdraw south once Manila was declared an open city. But Iwabuchi had other ideas. Haunted by his past, consumed by guilt, he saw in Manila a chance to reclaim his lost honor, even if it meant annihilation. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, now commanding all Japanese forces in the Philippines, understood the hopelessness of defending the capital. He wanted to fight a drawn-out campaign in the northern mountains, preserving his troops and supplies for attrition warfare. "Manila," he told his staff, "is indefensible. We will not sacrifice our men for empty glory." On January 6, 1945, he issued a direct order to Iwabuchi: evacuate the city, destroy any material of military value, and regroup in the hills. Iwabuchi disobeyed. Instead of withdrawing, he fortified the city. He had roughly 12,500 naval personnel, reinforced by about 4,000 Army troops, most of them sailors without ships, aircraft mechanics, or Marines detached from sunken vessels. Yet they were heavily armed, with stockpiles of artillery, naval guns repurposed for land combat, and countless mines, grenades, and explosives. They built barricades of sandbags and concrete in the streets, mined intersections, and converted public buildings into fortresses. The post office, city hall, and the legislative and finance buildings became strong points. In the south, near the Pasig River, they constructed an elaborate defensive line centered on Intramuros, the 16th-century Spanish walled city at Manila's heart. While Iwabuchi prepared, civilians continued their daily lives, unaware of the nightmare closing in. Manila was still home to nearly 1 million people, many believing liberation would come swiftly and peacefully. Japanese propaganda assured them the city would be spared. But as American artillery drew closer, the tone of the occupying troops changed. Soldiers began herding civilians into public buildings under the pretense of protection. Others barricaded doors, placed machine guns in windows, and set explosives in basements. The trap was being laid not just for the Americans, but for the city itself. Iwabuchi's motives remain debated even now. Some historians see him as a fanatic, obsessed with personal redemption. Others describe him as a man trapped by circumstance, unable to withdraw because of logistical chaos and conflicting orders. Whatever the reason, his decision condemned Manila. "Defeat," wrote a Filipino diarist named Pasita Pestaño Jacinto, "is a bitter pill the Japanese cannot swallow. It makes men into beasts." By the time American forces reached the northern outskirts of Manila on February 3rd, the stage was set for catastrophe. To the north, General Griswold's Aveyron Corps approached from Quezon City. To the south, Eichelberger's 8th Army advanced from Nasugbu and Tagaytay. The two forces were meant to link up in the city center, trapping the Japanese defenders. MacArthur, convinced that Manila could be taken largely intact, ordered minimal use of artillery and air power. "We must save this beautiful city," he said. "Manila is the heart of the Philippines. We will not destroy it to save it." But even as he spoke, the city was already burning. Iwabuchi's troops unleashed a campaign of terror unprecedented in the Pacific War. In district after district, Japanese soldiers massacred civilians, men, women, and children, often with knives, bayonets, or grenades. To justify their actions, they labeled all Filipinos guerrillas. One Japanese diary, later recovered, read, February 7th, 150 guerrillas disposed of tonight. I personally stabbed 10. February 9th, burned 1,000 guerrillas to death. February 13th, all guerrillas executed, set fire to their houses. In truth, these guerrillas were unarmed civilians. Families were rounded up in churches, schools, and hospitals, locked inside and set aflame. On Singalong Street, hundreds were bayoneted and thrown into burning buildings. Near the Bayview Hotel, Japanese officers selected young women, especially those of lighter skin, and took them to rooms upstairs where they were raped repeatedly by drunken soldiers. Survivors later told of screams that lasted through the night. Every evening was the same, said Luisa Guevara, one of the few who lived. They came for us again and again. I thought I would die, and I wanted to. By the second week of February, Manila had become hell on earth. Smoke blackened the sky, the streets were littered with corpses, and the Pasig River ran red. Yet Iwabuchi's men fought with fanatical determination. They had transformed every block into a fortress. Machine guns hidden behind sandbags, mortars positioned in courtyards, naval guns firing from shattered windows. The Americans, caught between compassion and necessity, had no choice but to fight house to house, room to room. MacArthur's plan to save the city was collapsing. His own commanders, watching their men die under sniper and artillery fire, begged for permission to use heavy weapons. MacArthur has visions of saving this beautiful city intact, General Griswold wrote in frustration. He does not realize that the skies already burn red every night as the Japanese systematically sack and destroy it. Even General Yamashita, far to the north, was horrified when he learned what was happening. He had no direct control over Iwabuchi's forces. They were Navy troops outside his command, but he sensed the enormity of the crime. In a rare moment of despair, he told an aide, Manila is finished. There will be no redemption for Japan there. By mid-February, the city that had once been the Pearl of the Orient was a blackened ruin. Entire districts, Ermita, Malate, Santa Ana, had vanished in flame. Tens of thousands of civilians lay dead, many in mass graves. Yet the battle was far from over. Iwabuchi's core units, entrenched in Intramuros and the government district, refused to surrender. For them, there was no retreat, no mercy, and no forgiveness. As the Americans closed in, the admiral made his final entry in his diary. If we run out of bullets, we will use grenades. If we run out of grenades, we will draw our swords. If our swords break, we will fight with our hands. When we have nothing left, we will bite their throats. We will die as warriors. He had found his redemption, not in victory, but in destruction. The Americans now faced a terrible choice. To defeat Iwabuchi, they would have to destroy the very city they came to save. And so, in the final weeks of February, Manila would be reduced to rubble, one block at a time. By the second week of February 1945, Manila was a city consumed. Smoke rose from every district. The air stank of burning flesh and cordite. The once graceful skyline, church domes, bell towers, and Spanish-era facades, was now a jagged silhouette against an orange sky. The Americans advanced street by street, but every block was a battlefield. Rear Admiral Iwabuchi's men had turned government buildings into bunkers, and every street corner into a killing ground. It was, wrote one U.S. sergeant, like fighting inside a furnace that screamed. General MacArthur's original hope, to liberate Manila intact, had vanished in the smoke. The Japanese showed no sign of surrender, and each hour cost hundreds of civilian lives. General Griswold pleaded for heavier firepower. We are losing men to snipers hiding behind women and children. The city is already dead. Let us end it. Reluctantly, MacArthur authorized artillery. What began as precision fire turned into an unrelenting bombardment. The great guns of the 6th Army fired from the northern districts, shells slamming into government buildings only a few hundred yards away. Entire blocks collapsed, walls folded like paper. American units, especially the 37th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions, had to reinvent urban warfare on the spot. They created assault squads of flamethrowers, bazookas, and demolition experts. Infantrymen advanced behind rolling curtains of flame. "You didn't see the enemy," one private recalled. "You just burned the room and prayed they weren't waiting with grenades." In the ruins of the legislative building, Marines fought through marble corridors slick with blood. At the post office, Japanese sailors refused to yield even when the roof collapsed. In the Rizal Memorial Stadium, snipers nested beneath the bleachers until engineers flooded the tunnels with gasoline and set them alight. Meanwhile, civilians were trapped between the two armies. Thousands tried to flee across the Pasig River on makeshift rafts, only to be caught in crossfire. Others hid in churches, believing sanctuaries would protect them. They did not. At the Provisor power plant, hundreds were machine-gunned after being promised safety. In Ermita Church, refugees were massacred at the altar. The pews were red. A survivor whispered years later, "We prayed, but the prayers drowned in screams." The U.S. soldiers, hardened by months of combat, began to lose their composure. Many entered houses only to find mutilated families. One lieutenant wrote home, "I am beginning to understand hate." American flamethrowers answered Japanese atrocities with merciless efficiency. Few prisoners were taken. Yet even among the carnage, acts of humanity flickered. GIs pulling children from cellars, Filipino nurses treating both sides, chaplains giving last rites amid falling shells. The geography of Manila made the battle even crueler. The broad boulevards offered no cover, and the centuries-old stone of Intramuros resisted everything but the heaviest shells. Engineers brought up 155mm howitzers and fired point-blank at the walls. On February 23rd, U.S. guns unleashed nearly 8,000 rounds in a single hour, reducing bastions that had stood since the Spanish conquest. Assault teams crossed the Pasig in stormboats under withering fire. Smoke shells blinded defenders. Then flamethrowers cleared the breaches. One report from the 37th Division recorded, "Every conceivable method was used, including gasoline and oil." When we entered the chambers afterward, the enemy lay piled high, burned as they had burned others. Inside Fort Santiago, the Americans discovered rooms stacked with corpses, men, women, and children tortured and shot. In one chamber, bodies were still bound with wire. In another, prisoners had suffocated in sealed tunnels. A soldier scrawled on a wall, "This is why we fight." By the end of February, Iwabuchi's remaining troops, perhaps 2,000, were confined to the government district. The 1st Cavalry and 37th Divisions surrounded them, blasting one building after another. On February 25th, Iwabuchi radioed a final message. "We have fulfilled our duty. I will soon join my ancestors." He shot himself inside the ruins of the Agriculture Building. MacArthur declared Manila liberated on March 3, 1945. Yet what the Americans entered was not a city, but a graveyard. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, roughly 1/10 of Manila's pre-war population. Historians estimate that about 60% were killed by Japanese atrocities and 40% by Allied bombardment. The U.S. lost 1,010 men killed and 5,165 wounded. Almost half belonged to the 37th Division. When MacArthur walked through the ruins of the Manila Hotel, once his residence, he stopped before the blackened remains of his old suite. "I have come home," he murmured, "and found my house burned." His aide, General Bonner Fellers, later wrote to his wife, "The long, drawn-out battle was caused by a futile effort to save Manila and the civilians. In trying to save it, we destroyed it. The Pearl of the Orient was gone. What remained was silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant toll of a church bell that somehow survived. The liberation of Manila marked the bloodiest urban battle of the Pacific War, a triumph laced with tragedy. For MacArthur, it was supposed to be vindication, a living monument to his promise, "I shall return." Instead, it became a wound that never healed. To many Filipinos, he was still the liberator, the man who brought freedom back to their islands. But to others, he was the general who let their capital die. The statistics were staggering. American forces suffered 16,200 dead and 47,000 wounded during the entire Philippine campaign. Japanese casualties were catastrophic, perhaps 500,000 dead, many from starvation and disease. Nearly 1 million Filipino civilians perished between 1941 and 1945. Entire families were erased, neighborhoods turned to dust. The old Manila, with its cobblestone streets and Spanish charm, existed now only in photographs. As the smoke cleared, questions began to rise. Could the tragedy have been avoided? Some historians blame MacArthur's ego, his refusal to allow early concentrated bombardment, and his obsession with symbolic victory. Others argue that his hands were tied. No general could have saved Manila once Iwabuchi defied orders. The truth lies somewhere in between. MacArthur's desire to protect the city slowed his advance, giving Iwabuchi time to dig in. When he finally unleashed artillery, it was too late. Compassion had turned to desperation. War correspondents struggled to describe what they saw. Life magazine called Manila the most completely devastated capital of the war except Warsaw. The New York Times wrote, "Liberation came at the cost of annihilation." For the first time, American audiences saw photographs of civilians burned or mutilated, proof that victory could be as horrifying as defeat. MacArthur himself was shaken. In public, he remained the image of command, erect, immaculate, pipe clenched in his teeth. But those close to him noticed the change. He slept little, walked the ruins alone at night, and spoke rarely of Manila again. One aide recalled, he believed it was his destiny to save these people, and destiny betrayed him. Yet the general pressed forward. The campaign was not over. Japanese forces still held the mountains of northern Luzon under General Yamashita. Thousands more remained on Mindanao and the Visayan Islands. MacArthur ordered new landings, determined to finish what he had begun. Filipino guerrillas joined the fight, hunting Japanese stragglers through jungles and valleys. The enemy, short of food and medicine, began to collapse. By May 1945, Bataan and Corregidor, symbols of humiliation in 1942, were recaptured. For MacArthur, it was a moment of redemption. "The ghosts of Bataan," he said at a memorial ceremony, "have been avenged." Still, even in victory, the specter of Manila haunted him. Every visit to the capital was a reminder of loss. He looked at the ruins as if he saw the faces of the dead, a journalist wrote. The city's residents, rebuilding amid the ashes, shared that gaze. They were free, but freedom had come at a terrible price. In Washington, debates flared about whether the Philippines should have been bypassed entirely. Some planners argued that seizing Iwo Jima and Okinawa would have sufficed for the bombing of Japan. But MacArthur's defenders countered that the Philippines was not just a strategic point, it was a moral one. The islands had fought and suffered for America. To abandon them would have been unthinkable. MacArthur viewed the Allied return, historian John McManus wrote, as something akin to rescuing a beloved family member, an almost mystical act of redemption. That redemption, however, was built upon ruins. In the months after liberation, the Philippines lay shattered. Infrastructure destroyed, industries gone, population decimated. Yet the spirit of the people endured. Schools reopened among the rubble. Children wrote lessons on broken blackboards. Church bells were recast from shell casings. The same resilience that had kept them alive through occupation now fueled their recovery. For MacArthur, Manila was both crown and cross, his greatest victory and his deepest guilt. In later years, when critics accused him of arrogance, he would answer quietly, "You did not walk through Manila." The war in the Philippines did not end with the fall of Manila. General Yamashita retreated into the northern mountains, commanding what remained of his once proud army. He knew the end was inevitable, but refused to surrender. "We will fight until the last rifle is empty," he told his men. Starved, sick, and cut off, Japanese units fought from caves and ridges until Japan's formal capitulation on August 15, 1945. When U.S. forces finally captured Yamashita near Kiangan, he appeared calm, almost relieved. In the months that followed, he was tried by an American military tribunal for war crimes committed by troops under his overall command, including the atrocities in Manila. The defense argued that Yamashita had no control over Admiral Iwabuchi's naval units, and that communications had collapsed, but the tribunal found him guilty under what became known as the Command Responsibility Doctrine. A commander is accountable for crimes he fails to prevent. Before dawn on February 23, 1946, Yamashita was hanged at Los Baños. In his final statement, he wrote, "The time has come to atone for my guilt with my death. But I do not believe all the crimes for which I am blamed can be erased by my execution. The stains I leave upon mankind cannot be washed away by the mere ending of a life." His body was buried in secret. His legend, half demon, half tragic figure, lives on in military ethics to this day. The Philippines emerged from the war free but broken. 1 million civilians dead, entire cities erased, a generation scarred. Yet the people rebuilt. Manila rose slowly from its ashes. The ruins of Intramuros became a memorial. The old city walls still bear shrapnel scars. Each February, survivors gather in silence to remember those lost, not with speeches, but with candles flickering against the stones. For the United States, the Philippine campaign reaffirmed its role as a liberator, but also forced a reckoning with the human cost of victory. The images of Manila, charred children, shattered churches, streets choked with bodies, haunted a nation that had grown accustomed to triumph. When American troops later entered Tokyo, many whispered, "This is Manila's echo." Douglas MacArthur left the Philippines in 1951, hailed as a hero but shadowed by controversy. To the end of his life, he spoke of Manila only rarely. When asked by a reporter what he remembered most from the Pacific War, he replied after a long pause, "The sound of a church bell over a burning city." Today, almost 8 decades later, Manila still bears the ghosts of 1945. Beneath the concrete and neon, beneath the noise of traffic and life, lie fragments of walls, bones, and memories. The Pasig River flows quietly past them, as if carrying the city's sorrow out to sea. The Battle of Manila stands as both warning and lesson, a reminder that liberation can come wrapped in fire, that honor pursued without mercy becomes ruin, and that the line between savior and destroyer is sometimes only a breath. MacArthur's famous words, "I shall return," were fulfilled. But when he did, he found not the city he had left, only its ashes. And from those ashes, the people of the Philippines rebuilt, because as one survivor said years later, the city died, but the heart of Manila never did.